Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony. My name is Gerard Pratt, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Air Force is Flight Lieutenant Elise Carey. Today marks the 90th anniversary of the unveiling of the Menengate Memorial to the Missing in Ypres, Belgium. Initial reaction to this, the first memorial to the missing to be established by the Imperial War Graves Commission, was wide-ranging. Austrian writer Stefan Zweig described it as being more impressive than any triumphal arch or monument to victory that I have ever seen. Siegfried Sassoon's poem on passing the new Menengate condemned it as a sepulchre of crime. Others praised its simplicity. Sir Reginald Blomfield, who designed the ark, said it was a work by which he wished to be remembered. In medieval times, the original narrow gateway on the eastern side of the city of Ypres had been called the Handgot Poort, port being the Flemish word for gate. By the outbreak of the First World War, the gateway was known as the Menenpoort, or Menengate, because the road running through it led to the nearby town of Menin. During the First World War, British and Dominion soldiers passed through the Menenpoort on their way to the front lines. While Menengate was the closest town gate to the fighting, the location was extremely dangerous due to the German shell fire, and most troops leaving for the front line used other gates. 5 major battles occurred around Ypres during the First World War, including the battle today commonly known as Passchendaele. Although the memorial bears the names of almost 55,000 soldiers, including 6,000 Australians, so great were the casualties that not all the names of the missing could be included. Over 300,000 British and Dominion soldiers were killed in the Ypres salient, more than 90,000 of whom have no known grave. Some 35,000 British and New Zealand soldiers whose remains were never recovered from the fighting in the area are commemorated on the Tyne Cot Memorial near Passchendaele. Latin inscriptions on either side of the Menengate's archway read Pro Patria and Pro Rege, for country and for king. And there is an inscription inside the archway composed by Rudyard Kipling, which reads, Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam, to the greater glory of God. Here are recorded names of officers and men who fell in the Ypres salient, but to whom the fortune of war denied the known and honoured burial given to their comrades in death. In 1936, the 2 large stone guardian lines that originally stood on plinths on either side of the Menenpoort were donated to the Australian War Memorial by the Mayor of Ypres as a gesture of friendship. They had been damaged by the German shell fire, which reduced much of the city to rubble during the war. Restoration work was completed in 1987, and the lions were placed inside the front entrance to the Australian War Memorial in 1991. In 2014, the Menengate lions went on loan to the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, and more recently, the lions travelled to their original home of Ypres as part of commemorations of the First World War. Every evening the last post is sounded under the great arch of the Menengate. The last post ceremony conducted here at the Australian War Memorial was inspired by this moving tribute. Today we commemorate the Menengate Memorial to the Missing and remember those Australians whose names are engraved upon its walls. We pay our respects to the men and women commemorated here on the Roll of Honour and to the survivors who returned home. This evening we're honoured to acknowledge His Excellency Mr. Ahmed Uzumju, Director General, Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, Turkey, and His Excellency Mr. Hamet Vakur Gökdenzia, Turkish Ambassador to Australia. We also acknowledge Mr. John King, President, Returned and Services League, ACT branch. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony from across Australia. During the ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection by visitors and students on behalf of the following schools from Queensland: Korparoo State School, Korparoo; St Patrick's School, Gympie; and Our Lady of Mount Carmel School, Korparoo. I invite you all now to please stand and join in singing the National Anthem. Students, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through until the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Private William Charles Delaney. William Delaney was born on the 20th of October, 1882, in Newtown, Tasmania, to William and Mary Delaney. He grew up in Hobart and attended Trinity Hill Public School. After leaving school, he worked as a labourer and served 2 years with the Tasmanian Garrison Artillery Militia. His service ended when he moved to Sydney, where he worked as a labourer. Following the outbreak of the First World War, Delaney applied to enlist for service in the Australian Imperial Force at Narrabri on the 16th of November 1915. He was called up in February 1916 and joined the newly formed 33rd Battalion, which was in camp at the Armidale Showgrounds. On the 4th of May, he left Sydney with his battalion aboard the transport ship Marathon, bound for England, where he spent several months training before sailing to France in November. The 33rd Battalion entered the front line for the first time at the end of November and spent the following months rotating in and out of the frontline duties. During the terrible weather of 1916 and 1917, Delaney contracted bronchitis and spent some time in hospital. The 33rd Battalion took part in its first major battle at Messines on the 7th of June. Along with the rest of the 9th Brigade, it led the 3rd Division's assault and captured its objectives. The battalion held its newly won positions for several days afterwards, enduring heavy German shelling and suffering heavy casualties. The battalion rotated in and out of the front line at Messines throughout July. During a period of particularly heavy bombardment, Delaney performed the following acts of gallantry. Under a continuous heavy barrage, Private Delaney attended to many of our wounded and carried them to the regimental aid post in full view of the enemy. Casualties that occurred in his sector could not be evacuated expeditiously through our trenches, and this gallant man repeatedly carried them overland, absolutely regardless of all personal danger. During the period from the 11th of July to the 17th of July, 1917, he worked continuously, and although badly shaken, he refused to rest. By his untiring efforts and gallantry, he undoubtedly saved the lives of several of his comrades. His splendid devotion to duty, together with his cheerful readiness, greatly inspired the whole battalion. Private Delaney accompanied 2 of our raids and did excellent work in the Battle of Messines. Also, he displayed great courage and devotion to duty and worked without relief for the 96 hours we were in the line. He was awarded the Military Medal in mid-September. Just a few weeks later, in the early hours of the 30th of September, the 33rd Battalion returned to the front line near Zonnebaker. That morning, it suffered 3 casualties, one of whom was Delaney. He was 35 years old. He was buried behind the lines, but his grave was lost in the ensuing fighting. Today, he is commemorated on the Meningate Memorial at Ypres, which bears the names of almost 55,000 soldiers, including 6,000 Australians. His name is also listed on the Roll of Honour on my right, among more than 60,000 Australians who died while serving in the First World War. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Private William Charles Delaney, MM, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozieres, or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses belly working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. We thank you all for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.